Great. Thank you so much, Alex, and thanks to the general chairs and program chairs and everybody else for all of the really hard work that they've put in. So I am extremely excited and honored to be here to welcome you all to the first keynote of the FatStar conference this year, and to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jon Kleinburg. Jon is a professor of computer science and information science at Cornell University. His research focuses on the interaction of algorithms and networks and the role that these things play in both social and information systems. He's the co-author of 2 books, Algorithm Design and Networks, Crowds, and Markets. And he has a whole host of honors. Among other things, he's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering. And he's a recipient of research fellowships from the MacArthur, Packard, Simons, and Sloan Foundations. So Jon is going to come up and talk to us today about some of his more recent work on fairness. The way that this is going to work is he's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a back and forth discussion afterwards for the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll see how things go. And then we'll take questions from the audience after that. So with that, I would like to welcome up Jon Kleinburg.
All right, let's see. I think this will work. Great, and yeah, if we could switch over to the slides for the other slides. Do I do that, or yeah, let me do that. Good. Never quite sure. All right. Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak here and for the kind introduction. It's an honor to get to start out this conference with this talk, or at least start out the post-Tuesday parts of the conference. It's really, I wanted to start by adding my own thanks to the organizers, to Alex and Fernando's program chairs, to the general chairs. A huge amount of work goes into assembling a conference like this, and all the more so, I think, when it's really striving to include perspectives from such a wide range of communities. And actually, that seemed like a reasonable place to actually start the slides of my talk with sort of the mental model that I went into this talk with, thinking about all the areas that have been brought together at this conference. There are a number of interdisciplinary conferences in computing, of course, but I think this one sort of stands out in how ambitious it's been in trying to bring together multiple perspectives from really a very, very wide range of areas. And it's useful to have mental maps like this, perhaps, in thinking about how to talk to an audience that's interdisciplinary. I think each of us would draw the map slightly differently, so if you want, you can take this as less of an outright overview and more of a snapshot of what my mental model is as I'm talking to all of you. I think it's also a very deep area in that it's addressing questions that all of these fields have grappled with over a number of years, and questions that actually benefit from deep insights from each of technical, empirical, conceptual, and qualitative perspectives. So I think for people thinking about research questions in this area, it's really a very nice opportunity to blend things in that sense. So I think each of us have our own story for how we first encountered this area, how we first started thinking about these issues, whether it was sort of very early in our careers or if we came to it relatively more recently. What I want to talk about is some joint work I've been doing with Sendhil, Mullainathan, and with Manish, Raghavan, who's here somewhere in the audience. And in a sense, it started, I think, with a realization that many of us had at some point, which is that there's this template, this sort of a pipeline that's being run in many, many different domains. And it's something that we can think about both algorithmically as well as empirically, qualitatively, and from all the other perspectives I've been mentioning. This notion that many decisions that are being made right now, there's sort of a functionality that's being shared between them, that's being exported to many different applications, what you might call algorithms for screening problems, right? Where I have some individual, and I'm trying to make a prediction about them. I map that person to some abstract set of features. It gets fed to some decision maker, and then a prediction about their future behavior is being made. And I'm sort of being deliberately abstract here in the sense that the individual could be any of a number of things. We could think of it as a person. It could be, in other cases, an individual could be other things. Similarly, decision maker could be an algorithm, as we'll see in many of the talks at this conference. It could be a human being. It could be an organization. Lots of things make decisions. And in some sense, the point is to abstract this out. So I want to mention a few places where this came up, and then some of the mathematical modeling that we've been trying to do, thinking about how this interacts with notions of fairness and bias. One other thing that I think is sort of relevant when we think about a collection of areas this broad is that, in a sense, it's incumbent on each of us to try to be more deliberate and maybe more explicit about the style in which we work, so that maybe people in communities quite distant from ours can get some sense of what goes into the work itself. I know I've certainly benefited when people working in areas far from me have tried to expose some of their thought process in what goes into the construction of the work. And so, in some sense, what I want to do is use this talk to try doing that in the case of the building of mathematical models. So I'll be talking about some models, but in some sense I wanted to focus at least as much on the sort of thinking behind the construction of the models as actually what ends up as the end product. So with that in mind, let's think about this as a kind of first abstraction, right? This is a sort of shared language that we can start from. It simplifies away many, many things, but in simplifying, it means that it's an interpretive lens that we can use in a lot of areas, right? So as a computer scientist, we see this pipeline being executed in any of a number of prediction problems, search engine ranking, ad placement, or for example, this screenshot from the Netflix help blog, which shows something about how they take an individual, namely you, reduce you to a set of features, namely your past ratings of movies that you've watched, and make a prediction about what you're going to think of this particular movie that they're considering, right? And that sort of runs the entire pipeline. But if this were only about things like this, it would in a sense be too narrow a conception, because the argument is, and this is sort of where Sendhil and I, when we were first thinking about these things, sort of realized there was this commonality in our interest, that the observation was that human beings are executing some version of this pipeline also. And one of the reasons I think that at this conference we often hear about this constellation of things like hiring, education, lending, and so forth, is that each of them have this screening decision functionality at the heart of them, right? So in a sense, when you read a resume, you've taken an individual, reduced them to a tabular set of features, and are making some kind of prediction, although the question of exactly what you're predicting is a remarkably complicated one. With, say, college admissions, we take someone with their whole K-12 experience, we reduce that to a set of features, and we make a decision. And again, exactly what we're trying to predict, not necessarily clear, but some version of this pipeline is taking place. Now, it's interesting that when we go to evaluate the outcomes of these things, let's stay with college admissions, it's easy to think about focusing on the outcome for the individual. There's an individual, they submitted an application, how was it evaluated, what happened, and to sort of take that as the frame within which we're auditing things. But in a way, that's not the only way that we talk about this, right? It's also important to zoom out, and we do this often even without thinking, right? So if I think about the class that's graduating this May from Cornell, the class of 2019, and I go back to when the admissions decisions were first announced for this class 4 years ago, spring of 2015, the headline in our local newspaper, the Cornell Chronicle, said the admitted class of 2019 is the most diverse in Cornell history, which was an exciting development. And I'll say something that, in a sense, is obvious, but we often don't pause to reflect on it. That's a statement about evaluating the set of outcomes, right? No one individual can be the most diverse in Cornell history. It's a statement about the admitted class and the composition of the admitted class. So there are a lot of cases where even when we're running this simple pipeline, we're thinking about the entire set that we select, and some property of that set that's sort of hard to synthesize from the property of any one individual. And I think of Scott Page at the University of Michigan as really having made this argument first, in a sense, that we can take notions like diversity and move them into more formal mathematical settings by thinking about these as functions on sets. I can look at the set of people I admitted, the set of people I hired, and so forth, and apply functions to those sets and try to measure something about the diversity, and then talk about the potential performance benefits of having diverse sets like that. And that's a lens that's actually been, I think, quite useful. So I want to try thinking about how we build models, not just of that pipeline I was showing you, but of ways of evaluating the outcome through set functions like measures of diversity. And in order to do that, we have to ask, what are some of the obstacles to achieving diversity? And here I want to delve a bit into some of the behavioral science research, because again, that's an ingredient that we'd like to use if we're going to build models. So there are a number of obstacles to diversity, as all of us know in this audience. Some of these are explicit attempts to prevent diversity, explicit forms of bias. But one of the dominant themes in behavioral science research over the past 2 decades has been that even people with the best of intentions are likely still engaging in bias. And that bias, therefore, is infinitely more widespread than we might think if we take a narrow view of bias as something that has to follow from bad intent. And secondly, and unfortunately, bias may be much harder to eliminate than if we just think of it as finding bad actors and controlling their behavior. So this notion of an implicit bias as something that a very large fraction, almost all of us, engage in, and that we have a very hard time consciously controlling, has become one of the dominant themes in thinking about bias, and therefore bias is an obstacle to increasing diversity. There are a number of interesting empirical studies that show some of the challenges. So the plot I have here is from this paper by Christine Veneros and Agnes Vold in the mid-1990s. And the idea they had was to look at evaluations that people made where we could look at some with a stated objective function, and then look at how the objective function played out in the future and ask how the quality of their predictions varied across things like race or gender. And so in particular, they were researchers, biomedical researchers in Sweden. And so they thought when people submit grant proposals to essentially the national funding body in Sweden, reviewers rate not just the proposal, but they rate the researcher on some measure of scientific competence, as they called it. And the scientific competence was supposed to be a measure of the impact of your work, right, as measured by publications, impact factor of publications, and so forth. And so in principle, you should be able to say, let's look at the competence score assigned to these researchers, and let's look at actually how their work played out and see how good were people at actually assessing the potential of these researchers. Okay? This was a little challenging because the national funding body of Sweden didn't want to actually hand over the evaluation records, but Sweden had very broad open public records laws, and so they requested them and actually got what was essentially sort of, for the first time, actual evaluations by a national funding agency that they could use, incorporate into their research. And what they found was the following, as shown in the plot. So the x-axis is the actual impact of the researchers as looked at over time, and the y-axis is the average competence score. So it's effectively saying, pick some level of competence score, pick 2.3, 2.4, and essentially, for female researchers to achieve that competence score required some non-trivial extra number of high-impact publications in order to get to that same level. Okay? And this was, again, mid-1990s was sort of in this early phase of behavioral science research on implicit bias. And so while we've now seen many, many studies of this type, the striking feature of the time was that this was not really a case where they had uncovered sort of a nest of bad actors in the Swedish national funding establishment. That was not what was happening. What was happening is that this was simply a pervasive fact about how these evaluations were being assigned. Now, it's challenging, of course, because anytime you do a study like this, there are many, many confounds, right? Maybe what's happening, people could argue, is that female researchers are working in areas that get lower citation counts, or they're working at universities that focus on areas of that type, right? How do we know that gender is the salient feature and not something that's highly correlated with gender? Not that that would eliminate the problem, but make it harder to diagnose exactly what the mechanisms were. And so that motivated Bertrand and Mullainathan, issues like this, how do we eliminate these kinds of confounds, to do what in a sense was the natural but sort of inspired next step, which is to make these researchers literally identical, right? So what they did, and this is a study many of us in this community know, but it sort of followed naturally from the issue of confounds around these field studies like Veneros and Vold. They took synthetic resumes, they generated names, and they actually did a pre-survey where they tried to assess the racial perceptions associated with these names. So they'd send names out to people and say, what race do you think this person is? And for some of the names, there was an overwhelming guess by the survey participants as to what race this person was. And so they took the ones that had been perceived as most white and most African American, put those names at the top of the resumes. And so they would send out identical resumes with just different names at the top. And the callback rates, like we'd like you to come interview for a job, on the ones that had names that were by survey perceived as African American was roughly 2/3 of what it was for the names that were perceived as white, right? And so now in a sense all the confounds were gone, right? Literally the name at the top was the only different thing in these resumes. And so again, this being such a pervasive problem says somehow this is widespread, it's a hard thing to control. Okay, so there are a lot of interventions that we can imagine, right? So let's go back to the goal of increasing diversity. Let's view this as the challenge. A lot of interventions. There's training, right? There's sort of improving process, and that's something that is an interesting direction that, in the interest of keeping this talk manageable in scope, I'm not going in. A different kind of intervention is the following thing. And here I'll begin abstracting out some of the language. So say we have some large pool of applicants, say there are n applicants, and we'd like to choose some sort of a short list of k of them. Maybe we would like to invite these k people for an interview. Maybe we're handing out, like a national funding body might, we're handing out fellowships or grants. Maybe we're putting them on an advisory board, we're putting them on a panel. We're doing something. But we'd like to choose these k people. And for simplicity, let's say there are just two groups, X and Y. And we're concerned about bias against the X candidates. Right? Again, all of these things we could extend once we understand what's going on here. So an increasingly popular intervention, if we're concerned about bias against the X candidates, is a thing called the Rooney rule. And the Rooney rule is very simple to state. It's simply that you commit to including at least one X candidate on your shortlist. You're supposed to choose K. We want to make sure that you include at least one from group X. It's called the Rooney Rule after Dan Rooney, who in 2002 was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers in the National Football League. And the NFL owners, in part because they wanted to do something about this issue and in part because they were facing an impending class action lawsuit, got together and they said, what can we do to increase the incredibly low representation of African Americans among head coaching positions in the NFL. At the time, very, very few head coaches in the NFL were African American. And so they said, going forward, when we interview for a head coaching position, one of the people that we interview must be an African American candidate. Okay? So this was something that escaped its framing in the NFL quite quickly and began getting adopted in academia, in industry, in the business world. It had a lot of high-profile advocates. In 2015, then President Barack Obama exhorted the tech industry to use this for executive hiring. One thing that is sort of appealing is a number of legal analyses of it argued that it was somehow effective at sort of sliding into a layer where it was doing something to remedy cases of manifest racial imbalance, but was also arguably legal in that it passed a three-pronged test that had been outlined in the Supreme Court case, United Steelworkers versus Weber, effectively that it's correcting imbalance, it's temporary, and it's imposing minimal cost on the other groups who are not the subject of the rule. Okay, so that's the Rooney Rule. a bunch of interesting empirical work on whether it actually had an effect. This is an interesting one by Cynthia Dubois in 2016, which effectively said, let's look at, now these are all small numbers, of course, but let's actually look at the fraction of head coaching positions that were filled by African-American coaches. And you can see 2002 is when the NFL owners decided we're going to start using the Rooney Rule. And the representation shot up dramatically in a way that it conspicuously did not for other positions with similar recruiting processes that were not subject to the Rooney Rule. So offensive and defensive coordinators, NCAA Division I head coaches. Okay, so there was some effect. Okay, so that's some empirical background. But as I said, like the original use of it became kind of almost a sort of template for how it got used in many, many other domains. And actually, I'm sure if a number of you in the room have been involved in recruiting or selecting panels or assigning fellowships, you've thought about something that basically is the Rooney Rule or closely resembles it. And so I've been involved in a lot of discussions about the effectiveness of it. Sometimes I'm in groups where everybody just sees this as a great thing. Sometimes we get into a conversation because some people are, unsure. They're like, does this really make sense to use this when, after all, it wasn't originally part of the selection process? And that debate typically goes as follows. And I think it's an important discussion to have with people as they sort of think about this process. That I'll be in groups and they'll say, we were brought together to pick the best candidates, right? The K best people. We're here to give out these fellowships or whatever. My goal is just to find the best people. Now you're imposing this extra constraint. Doesn't that work against our goal of finding the best people? And so it's sort of useful to think about what are they saying in this argument and how do we potentially sort of reason about this. So what they're saying is sort of a relatively clear-cut thing. It's worth articulating it, which is they're saying without the Rooney Rule, we were doing what you might call unconstrained optimization. Right? The mandate is pick the K best people. With the Rooney Rule, we're doing constrained optimization. You have to choose a set of K people that's as good as possible, subject to the constraint of having at least one X candidate. And as we know, unconstrained optimization does better than constrained optimization because you're optimizing over a bigger set of possibilities. Right? You always have the freedom to choose a set that has one X candidate, but you also have the freedom not to, whatever is going to give you the largest value. Okay? So after some of these discussions, I felt like that there were ways to push back against. There are a lot of ways to push back against this, obviously. One is to argue that the constructed criteria that they're talking about isn't actually the whole picture, and that this is way too narrow a view of the evaluation. But I was wondering, in fact, why I was even ceding that much territory in this argument. After all, to kind of continue the football metaphor, suppose we gave them the home field advantage of saying, sure, there is this actual numerical criterion that we're trying to optimize. Is it possible that even if we agree on that, right, even if we take this very narrow view that there's a single numerical criterion that we're trying to optimize, you can still improve performance by using the Rooney Rule, right? Let's sort of argue this on their terms, not cede that territory. Now, at first, this seems counterintuitive, because after all, the Rooney Rule is forcing you to optimize over a smaller set. And you're trying to maximize, you want to optimize over a bigger set of options. So why is there any chance that we could make this argument? Well, so Manish, Raghavan, and I were thinking about this. And the analogy that we had in mind is that we had just come from some work with Segal-Loren, where we were thinking about optimization in the presence of behavioral biases. And that was sort of happening here also. We have optimization in the presence of a behavioral bias. And one thing that we know about optimization in the presence of behavioral biases is that when you're dealing with someone who has a bias, sometimes constraining their behavior can lead to performance improvements even on the measures that they themselves have expressed as their objectives, even on the things that they care about. Right? They're biased, but you constrain their behavior. We all sort of know this intuitively, right? Anyone who has ever taken or taught, say, a graduate course with some long project knows that there are several ways you could do this. One way you could do this is to say, you're all grown-ups. We have a semester-long project. Here's all the things you have to do. It's due on the last day of class. Go. Because you're all very mature. Just budget your time. Anyone who's ever tried that knows that is a complete and unmitigated disaster, right? Because as you get to the final week, people who had been really meaning to kind of keep up this thing the whole time suddenly realize they sort of have to do everything now, and you get a lot of sort of running around and a lot of emergencies about how things aren't going to finish in time. So instead what you do is you constrain people's behavior. You say, milestone 1 is due after 3 weeks. Milestone 1 must consist of the following things. Milestone 2 is due after 6 weeks. It must consist of the following deliverables. And then finally, the final thing is due on the following date, right? You chunk this thing. And sure, maybe they benefit from the feedback you give them. But as we all know, in fact, that helps people even if you don't give them any feedback on the milestones. It simply causes them to do it on a certain schedule. But why should that be? After all, we're making them engage in constrained optimization, not unconstrained optimization, right? They always had the option to do that, but they had the option to do even more if you didn't make them do milestones. So that's, I think, the point. If you constrain people's behavior when they suffer from behavioral bias, constrained optimization can actually turn out better. OK, so I've made a qualitative argument for that. But I was intrigued by the idea, Manish and I wanted to explore this notion that maybe we could actually build a model in which we could actually show that happening, okay? That we could abstract that. So what would that mean, right? Can we build a model in which we have a simple numerical measure of performance, right? So we're arguing on the same terms of this debate. But in fact, the Rooney rule is now actually improving that simple numerical measure of performance, despite the fact that it's constraining your behavior. So if we're going to do that, we're going to need models of various things here, right? So something about what the applicant pool looks like, a model of the objective function we're trying to optimize, a model of the decision-making process, including the bias. And if we make assumptions about what all that looks like in the model, then as a consequence, we could examine the effect of the Rooney rule on the objective function. OK. Now, so I want to sort of, in this latter half of the talk, get into sort of how we went about trying to formulate a mathematical model. And here I want to come back to a point that I made at the beginning, which is I think it's useful in a setting like this where we have so many different perspectives represented for everyone to kind of try as much as possible to introspect about their own way they approach things through their own methodology. So I thought I would spend one slide on how is it that people with training like Manish and I have would go about trying to build a model in this situation. And in a sense, when you think about building mathematical models, it's often useful to think about a term that we like in computer science, the notion of an abstraction barrier. And there's sort of 2 key abstraction barriers in model formulation. And in a sense, if I'll only devote one slide to this, but if this is an issue that you find interesting or intriguing, the next session after this, which follows immediately after the end of this talk, has 2 very, very nice papers, very elegant papers that think about the role of abstraction barriers and their relation to modeling of issues in the world. One by my Cornell colleagues, Samir Passi and Selim Barakis, and then also the paper at the end of the session by Selbs, Boyd, Friedler, Venkata Subramanian, and Vertesi, thinking about some of the risks and some of the benefits of applying abstractions in these kinds of contexts. So an abstraction barrier is effectively this interface between the world and some kind of modeling activity that you do. Abstraction barriers really have nothing to do with technical solutions. All fields, qualitative or quantitative, engage in abstraction. That's somehow necessary because on the one hand there's the world, on the other hand there's you as a human being making sense of the world. That's an abstraction barrier that you can't make go away. In the case of mathematical modeling, we tend to think about the assumptions in the model and then the consequences that follow from those assumptions, right? And so one abstraction barrier is where we import information from the world into our assumptions and make assumptions. And a second abstraction barrier is where we take the consequences that follow from our assumptions mathematically and export those back out and try to make interpretations about the world. Inside the model, there's an extra link from the assumptions to the consequences. We should think of that as basically outside our control, right? That's simply what follows mathematically once we've made the assumptions. And so the activity, in a sense, is to think about reasonable assumptions that are as simple as possible to capture the behavior that you want, look at what consequences you derive, and in a sense, to try doing a loop in which you then do some iteration, right? Do the consequences seem reasonable? Are they simply an artifact of something in your assumptions that you need to think harder about? And we think in this way, okay? And often we try to sort of think of what is the simplest set of stylized assumptions we can make to derive some of these consequences, right? To be able to say, no matter what we believe about the world, it at least has these properties. Let's just use those. Okay, so this is how we're going to think about it. And you know, in a sense, in other contexts, it's exactly this distinction between, right, the human decision making which takes place in the world and either mathematical or algorithmic processes that take place within the model. Okay, so what does that look like in this context of the Rooney rule? And again, here our goal really was build a model so that we could actually say in some precise quantitative sense that despite the fact that we all agree there's a single objective function, constraining behavior in this way is actually improving performance. Okay, so we have to say something about the applicant pool. And if I think about the settings that we're talking about, say, you know, national funding bodies giving out grants, as in Van Ross and Vold, hiring committees looking at job applicants, as in Bertrand and Mullainathan, college admissions, all of these kinds of things. We have a group of people who are trying to make some prediction about the future performance of a person in order to select for them. Now, in the simplest version of the model, let's imagine there's no uncertainty. I have perfect prediction ability. So in effect, I'm solving a relatively easy problem were it not for bias. I know how well this person's going to do. And let's imagine, so we'll call these values in the applicant Z1, Z2, Z3, just listed by the applicants. And so for applicant I, Zi is their potential for future performance. How should that be distributed? Well, there's actually a relatively natural and sort of clear choice for that, which is that it should be drawn from a power law distribution, which means the probability that it exceeds some threshold t grows like t to the minus 1 plus delta. Why do I say that? Because there's been a huge amount of empirical work looking at going into different fields, look at the volume of output that people have in these different fields. So if I look at citations by academics, view counts by YouTubers, download counts by musical artists, revenue by entrepreneurs, many, many different settings. And I look at how many academics have T citations, how many YouTubers have T lifetime views, how many artists have T song listens, and so forth. You'll discover that the fraction that exceeds T looks like T to the minus something. Okay. Now, this is already sort of an interesting fact in itself about creative output and creative professions, because often when we think about measuring quantities in the world, we think in terms of exponential growth, right? That things should decay exponentially. That should be like e to the minus t, which would say that very large values are extremely rare. But t to the minus 1 plus delta means they're actually reasonably frequent, okay? Because that's a function that decays much, much more slowly. So think of power laws as saying it's a world where extreme outliers are rare, right? So we know there are people who just get enormous numbers of views, enormous numbers of song listens. And that's in a way what actually makes things like the Rooney rule so challenging. Because you're thinking to yourself, I'm trying to hire superstars, and I have these superstar outliers who are just way out there on the distribution. Surely I want to choose them. What effect will something like the Rooney rule have on my ability to choose those extreme outliers? Okay? Okay. So now we have an objective function. And let's take the simplest one, which is I'm trying to choose k candidates, and I just want to maximize the sum of their values. So in that sense, it's not quite like hiring, where I'm choosing a short list from which to then further subselect. Let's think of it as I'm giving out k fellowships, I'm giving out k grants, I'm putting k people on a panel or on a committee. They all contribute equally. Okay, we want a model of the decision maker. And the whole point, I think, with all the behavioral science work on evaluation is that these numbers may exist, but we certainly don't have conscious direct access to these numbers. I can't do computations on them when I'm, right? When we do academic hiring, no one is actually visualizing a lifetime future Google Scholar citation count and then doing arithmetic on it somehow. Rather, that's below some psychological abstraction barrier. And rather, what we're doing is saying, I look at two people, and I like this one better than that one. Okay? So let's take that as a, And again, this gets into issues of like, could we restructure processes? Maybe we should talk more in terms of numbers, but let's talk about the process in which we just make pairwise comparisons. If this were the whole story, we could solve this problem. These numbers come in, and I simply just do lots of pairwise comparisons. Is this one better than this one? Is this one better? I just play them off against each other, and I find the top k. Right? I just sort using comparisons. The problem comes in when we have some form of bias. So we have two groups, x and y, n candidates from group y, alpha times n from group x. So alpha is going to be the relative proportion of candidates from group x. That's my second parameter. Right? Delta, my power law exponent, is the first one. Alpha is the second one. The decision maker is going to exhibit just a very simple form of bias. Again, because we're trying to build a model in which sort of on all the dials that control how much complexity the model has, we're trying to turn all the dials down to as simple as possible. So they evaluate each y candidate, let's assume, perfectly. They know their future potential. They also evaluate the x candidates perfectly, except they divide down their future potential by this factor of beta greater than 1. And that's the third of my three parameters. The bias parameter, beta greater than 1. Okay? So they're only making a single kind of error in their prediction of the potential for these people, which is they're dividing down all the x candidates by beta. And again, if they really had access to these actual numbers, they could simply multiply back up what they thought about an x candidate by beta. But the point is, that's not a reasonable abstraction of what people are doing in these comparisons. They're only making ordinal comparisons. They have this bias they can't really control or directly access. And so now the question is, does the Rooney rule improve the objective function? We take candidates with potentials from this power law. They're either x candidates or y candidates. We divide down all the x candidates by beta. We sort. We take the top k. So in this picture here, for example, if k were 3, we would have satisfied the Rooney rule. But if k were 2, the top 2 would be y candidates. We'd be required to pick an x candidate. And this is somehow the heart of the tension, because on the one hand, we want to follow the data. If there are superstars out there, we want to pick them. On the other hand, we have this bias that we can't control that's causing us to devalue the x candidates, who we actually would want if only we could control for our bias. So which do you do? Do you believe the data, or do you correct for the bias? And the answer is that it actually depends on where in the space of parameters that you are. Right? So I have these three parameters: alpha, the relative proportion of applicants; beta, the level of bias; and delta, essentially the abundance of outliers, right? The heaviness of the extreme in the power law. And so the main results that Manish and I have here is we go into that phase space, right? We're in a three-dimensional space of parameters, and we carve it up into two regions: the region where the Rooney rule helps and the region where the Rooney rule does not help. Okay? And so effectively what it says is that for whatever your shortlist size is, there actually is a large region of that space where, despite the fact that we all agree you're just trying to pick the k best, constraining your behavior actually improves performance. Okay? So that it actually is the case that with this constraint, the biased agent actually does better, even on the stated objective function that they said they cared about. Okay? Now, it depends on the values of the parameters, whether this function is greater than less than 1. Despite the fact that we made the model as simple as we possibly could to get these ingredients, the functions actually are remarkably complicated. I put this one up there not so much to parse it, just to see that typographically it's indeed very complicated. I could maybe visualize it a bit better. This is k equals 2. I'm trying to pick two people. This is the bias surface in that space. So what does this say? On the two axes on the floor there is alpha, the representation of x candidates; delta, the abundance of outliers in the power law tail. And then the vertical axis is, this is the level beta of bias at which the Rooney rule becomes a good idea. As the bias goes up, the Rooney rule becomes a better and better idea, and eventually it actually is performance enhancing. And that's when, as you move up, you punch through this surface, and now you're above it. Okay? The surface, as you see, right, it wasn't just that the formula somehow was typographically complicated. The surface is actually complicated. It has these non-monotonicities in it that we still don't fully understand, but it carves up the space into these two regions, where constraining the biased agent improves their performance, where it doesn't. Just to give you some intuition about, I'm not going to be able to go through the technical details of the proof behind this, but let me just give you some sense of one thing that I think is sort of instructive for thinking about some of the intuition behind what's going on, which is, if you look at the sort of back wall of that surface, it's like swooping up in this cliff really, really fast in that yellow region. That yellow region is going off to infinity, which means that sort of behind the cliff wall, there's parts of the space where the Rooney rule is never a good idea. no matter how much bias there is. So let's ask that question. Let's ask what's behind that cliff. And so I'll talk about that for a couple minutes, and then I'll wrap up, and we can move on to some discussion. So what's behind the cliff is the question, for which alpha delta pairs, right, a representation of X, of one's outliers, does the Rooney rule improve utility as the bias goes to infinity? Right? So we have two slots. We're imagining we're in a world of infinite bias. And we're not in a world of infinite bias, but it is giving us some qualitative sense of what's going on in the model. When does it help to reserve a slot for an X candidate? Now, surely not, even with infinite bias, surely not always. I mean, if outliers are not, if outliers are relatively infrequent, and the X candidates are a microscopically small fraction of the population, then even if I'm biased, I'm going to lose in performance by reserving one of my two slots for a microscopically small fraction of the population, right? That's distinct from any of the fairness implications, but we're talking just about an argument that this is performance enhancing. But the surprising fact is that actually the Rooney rule is more powerful than you might initially think. So here's a fact that surprised us. No matter how small the fraction of X candidates, there's a small enough power law exponent, meaning a sort of strong enough abundance of outliers, so that the Rooney rule is actually improving utility. Right? So think about what this means. I have two slots. I have this very small fraction of the population called X. And despite that, I'm improving my performance by reserving a slot for them. How can that be, right? So there's sort of a mathematical argument, which I actually won't run through. I'll instead tell you some intuition for what's going on. In fact, when we started to formulate the intuition, our first reaction for the first sort of week when we had this intuition was, this fact must be wrong. We somehow went through the proof, but we don't understand what's actually going on. So here's some intuition, starting with why we didn't believe this fact initially. So imagine, let's put some real numbers to this. 80% belongs to group Y, that's the majority group. 20% belongs to group X. There's infinite bias against group X. I'm arguing that if the power law exponent is small enough, outliers abundant enough, I should reserve one of my two slots for that small group. Now, the reason why this is surprising is take my 80% that's in group Y, arbitrarily divide it into two groups that I'll call A and B. Right? So group Y is indistinguishable, but let's just declare these ones are A, those ones are B, each 40% of the population. Now ask yourself, is the expected maximum in group A bigger or smaller than the expected maximum in group X? Well, they're all coming from the same distribution, and A is twice as big. So the expected max in group A is bigger. Now group B, is the expected max in group B bigger or smaller than the expected max in group X? Well, the expected max in group B is bigger, because it's just a bigger set. So I've now named for you two people in group Y, the best in A and the best in B, who are both higher in expectation than group X. Yet you're telling me to reserve a slot for group X, and not for these groups A and B. How can this be? But it turns out that that worrisome intuition is actually not right. You really should reserve a slot for them. And the reason is that the question we're facing is not, do I pick the best in A and the best in X, or the best in A and the best in B? When I pick the best from Y, I get to pick the better of the best in A and B. What I'm leaving out is the second best from A union B. Right? I'm leaving out someone who's already dominated by that other group. Whereas the person I'm leaving out from X, in the case of infinite bias, is undominated. I have no information about anyone who's above them. And the point is, when you have a power law with a very, very heavy tail, the maximum value drawn from that power law is so much farther out than the second max that even the max over relatively small sets you expect to be bigger than the second max over relatively big sets. And so in the end, from sort of thinking about this model, it actually taught us something that I certainly hadn't really fully appreciated about the nature of bias from this abstract model. It's telling us that the real cost of bias is that when you disregard even a small set, the max in that set in a world of outliers is so good that you're paying enormous cost by replacing that with the second best even from a relatively big set. Right? That's actually what's going on. And that, in effect, is why the Rooney rule, by constraining your behavior, is actually improving performance. There are a bunch more things to say. I wanted to wrap up so we could move on to the discussion phase. But again, this first bullet has sort of been the punchline that we wanted our model to get at, this way in which constraints can actually improve performance. In our case, applied to this particular thing. A few other thoughts. It was a model designed to be as simple as possible, but it led to some rather complex behavior. And in a sense, it feels like we got more out of the model than we put in. We made some very simple assumptions, and we exposed, we opened up some very, very complicated behavior involving outliers, selection bias, and so forth. And so I think in the process, this modeling activity helped sharpen some of the arguments, and actually I think opened up a number of paths I think that are going to be interesting for further exploration. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Great. So first of all, thanks so much to Jon for the fantastic talk. So the way that we are going to structure this discussion is that Jon and I are going to spend the next maybe 10 or 12 minutes having a little bit of back and forth conversation about the material that he presented in this talk and kind of about the field more broadly, and then we'll have, if we have time, a couple of audience questions after that at the end. Great. So the first thing that I was hoping to talk about is, to start kind of digging deeper into this question of where mathematical modeling can help the Fat Star community and what we need to watch out for here. And this is something that Jon already touched on a lot in his talk, but I really kind of want to get into this deeper. But before I get into that, I just want to give you a little bit of context about where I'm coming from, since many people in this room don't know me. So I'm somebody who has done a lot of mathematical modeling myself. My background is really in machine learning theory and algorithmic economics, so I've been doing more empirical work later. But these kinds of mathematical models that Jon talked about are really my bread and butter in a lot of ways. I actually have a paper in this conference that uses mathematical modeling and ideas from game theory to study what happens when different populations have different abilities to strategically manipulate the way that they appear to classifiers, like more affluent high school students taking SAT prep courses to increase their chance of getting into college. But at the same time, I also work at a company, and I see how closely people in industry are following all of the research that goes on in this community. And we've got developers and product managers and lawyers and people who are really making these products that impact millions of users reading all of this work. And I do start to get worried sometimes that people might put too much faith in all of these mathematical notions like metrics or these so-called fair algorithms that are coming out of these papers, when we know that these algorithms might not actually be fair in practice because our modeling assumptions just don't hold in the real world. I also get a chance to collaborate with researchers from other disciplines, so I get to see kind of firsthand some of these differences in norms between different communities. Just as one example, I had this really eye-opening experience in the Fate reading group at Microsoft Research a couple of years back, where we were reading a computer science theory paper, so a paper that uses a lot of this mathematical modeling. I won't tell you which one. And the STS and law people in the group were just completely horrified by the introduction of this paper and how overreaching it was, making all of these kind of grand, broader connections. And I just sort of let them in on the fact that it's really common in CS theory papers and actually in computer science papers more generally to, have this kind of motivation in the introduction that's meant to be more of a high-level inspiration or aspiration for the work as opposed to a literal description of the problem that we're solving. There's kind of different ways that we write papers in different communities. And this is, of course, a more general problem that goes beyond CS theory. It's a general problem in interdisciplinary communities broadly. I personally don't have a great sense of how I'm supposed to read an ethnography paper or a law review paper and so on. So with that kind of long preamble out of the way, my first question is, given the high stakes nature of fairness and the interdisciplinary nature of this field, we have people with all sorts of backgrounds in the audience today. Do you think that we need to be presenting our work on fairness in a different way here than we presented in our home communities? And relatedly, aside from what you've already mentioned in your talk, do you think that there are disclaimers that you would give people in other communities about how they should be reading a CS theory paper?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and that's a good overview, I think, of some of the ways to think about it. I mean, my own sense certainly is that I think it's very important to distinguish between the part of the work in a mathematical paper or an algorithmic paper that leads up to the concrete problem formulation and the assumptions you make, and then the part that follows after you've made those assumptions. And I think often when we read these papers, there's a very clear break in the paper where you say, okay, now they're starting to actually formalize the problem. Upstream of that, whether or not the paper is explicit about that, they're making choices. They're making decisions about this is how we're choosing to model it. And I think there is a tradition, which I personally find useful in these mathematical communities, to try to be very expansive about how they arrived at the assumptions they arrived at. So I agree, there's sort of a danger in thinking that the person writing the introduction is saying this is the right answer. I think it's better interpreted as this is my thought process as I arrived at these assumptions, which you should always then feel free to push back on the assumptions. Once the problem's been formalized, things are now following mathematically, and we don't really get to play with that or change it. But in a way, therefore, if you want to argue with the conclusions, you have to figure out what in their assumptions did you not like. And I think that actually gives a kind of clarity to the argument. It sort of tells you where to localize the argument that I think works very well. And I think, again, I think it's useful in sort of each of these communities. Like all fields make assumptions when they go into their work. To the extent that each of our fields can be explicit about where that part's happening, crucial. Right, and then on your other question, I think in this talk I talked about motivating a particular model that gave us some mathematical insight. Often these sort of frameworks are being used to motivate an algorithm that then gets deployed. And then I think it's all the more important to say, if you're going to use this algorithm, it makes sense once the problem's been formalized, but we now need to really examine the formalization in order to know is the algorithm appropriate. And so I think, for example, had the Rooney rule not existed, and I were in a parallel universe where I was using this talk to motivate the Rooney rule, then we should certainly be asking, do we believe that these assumptions are faithful enough to the situation that this is a reasonable recommendation?
Yeah. I actually think that this distinction that you're making between models on the one hand that provide insight into some general problem and models that are created in order to justify the design of a particular algorithm that we're going to use is kind of spot on. And this is kind of a distinction that's been at the heart of a lot of my own personal soul searching around the role of theory in the fat star community. I should say that so far, the work that I've done in fairness that uses mathematical modeling has all been more of this first type. So using models as a means to provide insight into some kind of general phenomenon that's going on. And in some sense, this really feels like a little bit less risky to me than using models to generate algorithms for fairness. But that said, I do think that there's actually a lot of potential for algorithmic work to have big impact in this community, and we shouldn't kind of discount that. I think the potential is really there if people are careful. I think that we've seen similar things happen in other socio-technical fields as well, like privacy and security, and maybe there are things that we can learn from that, right? So if we think about privacy, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this now, and I hope that Cynthia Dwork is not watching this, but a decade ago when I was seeing all of this work coming out in differential privacy, my sense was that, this is fantastic theory work, this is really beautiful, but it didn't really seem practical to me at all because there are all of these parameters that needed to be set in order to specify the desired level of privacy, and setting these parameters is really making an assumption about the level of privacy that's needed in the real world, and we don't necessarily know what this level of privacy needs to be for real applications. But now, looking back, of course, it's clear that this work has had a huge amount of impact. We've now got differential privacy being used in the US Census and so on. And now it's clear that this work, which really came from this beautiful theoretical model, has had real impact. Of course, it's going to be the same case there, that if your modeling assumptions don't hold, then your guarantees don't hold. If you assume that you have some trusted third party that's going to do your computation and it turns out that that party is leaking data, then all of your privacy guarantees just disappear. But it's still important. And I think that the same type of algorithmic work could come out of the fairness community as well. It's just a little bit less clear to me, at least right now, what that will look like. Okay, so I just want to switch gears a little bit now, turning back to your talk. So I really like the model that you have in this paper as a way of kind of fighting back against people who invite these all-white, all-male panels of speakers and insist that they're just choosing like the most qualified speakers to sit on a panel at a conference, right? This comes up all the time. And if you're convening a panel of speakers, I think that something like using the sum or average of people's potential kind of makes sense as an objective to consider. I'd really like to be able to make a similar argument in favor of something like the Rooney rule in hiring, but to me, hiring seems like a much more complicated scenario. And we've got multiple levels of bias that we need to consider for something like hiring, right? So there's a huge literature and bias in interviews. Like, this is a real thing. It's very well studied. I don't know this literature super well, but my impression is that there's actually more bias that comes in during the interview stage than there is during this initial selection stage. And this is something that I've seen personally in my own experience as a shy, introverted woman who doesn't feel particularly comfortable hyping myself up in interview settings, right? So I'm wondering, do you think that this model that you have here could be extended to take into account these biases at multiple levels? So these biases at the selection process, but then also this bias at the next level once we have our set of candidates that includes a minority?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think that it's sort of interesting to think about when you have a model and then you want to extend it, you sort of think about what are the extra features in the world that I'd like to represent, how might I adapt things. So, one thing about interviews, of course, is if we sort of abstract what they're doing, there's a sort of effort allocation problem where if I get 1,000 applications, I triage them by reading a relatively small amount about each one. That's sort of like the selection process we're talking here. And then I say, okay, now I'm going to look much more closely at some smaller set. For example, I will fly them out for interviews. And so one thing certainly here, you could imagine taking what was a one-shot process here. I'm selecting the top K and turning it into a multi-stage process. I give you a limited amount of information about many things from which you must make a medium-sized selection. So you must pick M out of those N. You can now get more information about them, and now you have to pick K, right? That might model the idea of an interview where you're now, right, or and of course, there's no reason to only do 2 rounds of interviews. For example, I've been part of NSF programs where from the letters of intent, they select people for the pre-proposal. From the pre-proposal, they select people for the proposal. And from the proposal, they select people for the site visit. And you actually have a 4-level stage of, and again, it's this extracting more information every step. So I think something which said I have features, the set of features I get to see widen at every step, and then how does that interact with more bias coming in potentially is, yeah. That's certainly one proposal for how to do it, but there are probably many proposals.
Yeah, and you might need additional interventions as you go along. It just might not be enough to have this initial diverse panel. You might need additional interventions after that point too.
I think like another thing that comes up is the idea of robustness, right? Like if multiple different ways of modeling something give you similar conclusions, you say there might be something qualitatively robust if many different sets of assumptions, which, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we are just about out of time for the discussion portion, but we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. I don't know if there's a mic that people are supposed to be. Yes, there are mics at the side if people want to come up.
So Michael Ekstrom, Boise State University. One of the things that captured my attention, what you were talking about, is this, what I think we can frame as a spurious trade-off between the diversity goal and the numeric accuracy or the quality score. And we see trade-offs that either show up or don't in other places, such as your result in Alex Toldachova's of the trade-offs that show up where we don't want them in fairness metrics, Or over in recommender systems, there's a lot of work that talks about trading off diversity and accuracy, but when we look at what users actually perceive, it's not clear that trade-off actually exists at all. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we can refine our intuitions about what trade-offs to really expect to be able to be more skeptical of what we assume is a trade-off, or better hunt for trade-offs that might be there that we don't think to look for in the first place.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, it's easy to sort of see a trade-off, and then the question is it genuinely there, or is it a consequence of some assumptions you made? I think right in the case of the trade-offs among, say, different fairness measures, like in the work that Alex did or that Manish, Sendhil, and I did, there I feel like that was almost a kind of model-free trade-off in the sense that it was really just about the impossibility of getting certain averages to come out the way that you want. That one felt robust in that sense. In some of these other cases, the trade-off comes up because you make a model of the decision maker, you make a model of what's being optimized that sort of on deeper inspection isn't actually the way the optimization is happening. So the fact that the agents are behaviorally biased is why that happened here. It can happen for other reasons in different contexts. But I think trying to enumerate different reasons why the decision making is not actually what you modeled it as may be at the heart of some of this.
I agree. And I just want to mention another place where I've seen this come up a lot is in the interpretability literature. People are always claiming that there's this trade-off between accuracy and interpretability, but every time that people actually start studying this empirically, at least on kind of simple models, it seems to not be the case at all. So empirical studies are useful for that too. I think we have time for one more question for Jon.
Yeah, should we go that time?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very, very interesting. My name is Tanya. I'm a researcher at Tilburg University. My background is in human rights law. And I wonder how you would respond to my argument, which is that in tackling one type of bias, you are actually creating a different kind of bias. And I'm going to give you two brief examples to explain my point. So on my way here, I watched a movie about athletes, and they commented how the new rules about selecting athletes are actually would have prevented them from being top stars in the sport. And this is because currently there is a use of algorithms to calculate the optimum height, weight, and body proportions that make an athlete a good candidate. But these particular famous stars explained that they didn't have perfect bodily parameters, but that they used their creativity, for example, to compensate for certain shortcomings that they had, such as shorter arms or other kinds of bodily parameters. So the moment you start using features to select candidates, you create other kinds of bias because the features only capture that which can be quantified, or they capture that more easily. And my second example is that you are creating a new kind of bias in that you are favor candidates who come from diverse backgrounds, whose families are middle class, and you leave behind the candidates who come from diverse backgrounds from poor families. And the example would be that in Detroit, there are some children, they go to school, but they don't attend English classes because their school cannot afford to pay the teachers. And so you can imagine how difficult it is for these kids to have the same kind of SAT scores as, for example, a racialized candidate who actually lives in a middle-class community. So how would you respond to this concern?
Yeah, these are all excellent examples that you bring up. I think there are sort of a few ingredients that you're very accurately pointing out. One is that the world is described by a very wide set of features. There are many things I could know about a person, and maybe if I knew all of them, I could really form an estimate of their future potential. At best, we get some narrow slice, and if we build a model on that, we're going to be throwing away information, maybe necessarily. A second one is the idea of once we decide this is the optimum height, weight, and so forth for an athlete in a certain sport, we just focus on that. I think that also comes from people not being careful enough about, say, the exploration-exploitation trade-off. That some of the whole theory of online learning tells us that even once you think you have the right set of parameters, you should continue exploring suboptimal cases as you continue iterating your model. The analogy in athletics would be that we should continue also recruiting athletes with you. And third, I guess, the issue that people have different levels of resource to actually improve their features. For that, I'll actually make a mention of this very nice paper that Jen has in the final session of this conference with Lily Hu and Nicola Morlica, precisely on this. This issue that people have differential access, say, to improve their standardized test scores or other things. You can actually then have bias coming through that differential access to resources. So I'd recommend Jen's paper as one way to look at that.
Thanks. I think we're about to be physically dragged off of the stage here, so we'll wrap
All right.
it up.
Thanks again.